The boardroom on the 31st floor of the Pemberton Tower in downtown Toronto had the kind of silence that money buys, thick, deliberate, and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the leaves outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had gone the color of old copper. 14 people sat around a table that cost more than most Canadians spent on their first car, and at the far end of that table, near the window, a man named Russell Holt was refilling water glasses. He did it the way he did everything, quietly, without announcement, his movements efficient and unhurried. He was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something better. Steady, worn in, readable only to people who knew how to look. His hair had gone mostly gray at the temples in the last 2 years. His daughter said it made him look distinguished. He told her it made him look tired. She said those were the same thing. He'd been with Torrance Logistics for 11 years. His official title was Senior Infrastructure Coordinator, which was a phrase that meant almost nothing to anyone, including most of the people who worked there. What it actually meant was that Russell Holt kept the company's operational backbone from falling apart. The fleet routing systems, the warehouse network integrations, the cross-border tracking protocols that nobody thought about until they stopped working. He had built most of those systems himself, in the early years, in the evenings, after his daughter Emma went to sleep. That was before Rebecca died. After, the evenings got longer and the work got more necessary, and he built the rest of them too. Nobody in that boardroom knew any of this. To the people around the table, Russell Holt was the man who refilled the water. At the head of the table sat Colette Dreyfus, the newly appointed CEO of Torrance Logistics, 6 weeks into the job and still wearing her authority like a coat that didn't quite fit. She was 51, sharp-featured, with a consulting background and a habit of saying things like, "Let's pressure test that," and "I want to interrogate the data." She had inherited a company in good functional shape and had immediately begun the process of explaining to everyone why it needed to change. To her left sat Derek Faulkner, the VP of Strategic Development, who had flown in from the Calgary office and who had been the one to arrange today's meeting. Across from him were the representatives from Meridian Pacific Partners, a Vancouver-based investment consortium that was considering a significant stake in Torrance's northern expansion. The lead on their side was a man named Paul Weatherspoon, who wore his skepticism the way other men wore cologne, generously and at all times. The purpose of the meeting was to present Torrance's 5-year infrastructure expansion plan. Derek Faulkner had been working on the presentation for 3 months. It was thorough, well-designed, and contained a projection model that had been built by a junior analyst named Tyler, who had graduated in the spring and had excellent instincts for formatting. Russell had been asked to be present in case the boardroom's AV system needed attention. He had fixed it twice in the past year, both times during important meetings, and Colette Dreyfus had noted that having him nearby was practical. He set the water pitcher down and moved to the side of the room, where a small service table had been arranged with extra folders and a backup laptop. He stood there with his hands at his sides and watched the presentation begin. Derek Faulkner clicked to the 3rd slide and began explaining Torrance's proposed Northern Logistics Corridor, a route that would connect 3 new warehouse nodes across northern Ontario and Manitoba, feeding into a restructured cross-border channel with the American Midwest. It was ambitious. It was also, Russell knew, built on a routing architecture that no longer matched the physical infrastructure on the ground. He had flagged this 8 months ago in a written report that had been acknowledged with a reply email from Derek's assistant that said, "Thanks, Russell. We'll loop you in as things develop." They had not looped him in. He watched Paul Weatherspoon lean forward slightly as Derek moved to the slide on projected transit times. "These numbers," Weatherspoon said, interrupting without apology, "assume what kind of handoff efficiency at the Sudbury node?" Derek paused. The model accounts for standard processing windows with a 15% buffer. Doubly standard processing windows based on what baseline? There was a half-second of silence. Derek glanced at his laptop. Based on our current operational benchmarks. Your current benchmarks at Sudbury, Weatherspoon said, or your current benchmarks at your southern nodes, because those aren't the same environment. Colette Dreyfus smoothed the front of her jacket. Derek, do you want to speak to the Sudbury-specific data? Derek turned to slide 7, which did not contain Sudbury-specific data. The full breakdown is in the appendix, he said, with the particular confidence of a man who hopes no one will ask to see the appendix. I'd like to see it, Weatherspoon said. Russell Holt knew what was in the appendix because he had read the full plan the week before, when Derek had sent it to the infrastructure team for a technical review that had amounted to an email asking if anything looked obviously wrong. Russell had sent back 3 pages of notes. Derek had replied, "Appreciate the input. We'll factor in what we can before the meeting." They had factored in nothing. He stood at the side of the room and watched Derek navigate to the appendix, which opened to a transit time model that used routing data from 2021. Before the highway reconfiguration north of Sudbury, before the Kapuskasing Depot had been decommissioned, before any of the ground-level changes that Russell had spent the last 3 years managing in real time. Weatherspoon looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he said quietly to the woman beside him, Torrance's own legal advisor, who had flown in from Ottawa and who Russell vaguely recognized from a hallway conversation 2 years prior. "These numbers don't work." He said it in French. His colleague replied, also in French, "They're using old route data. The Kapuskasing node hasn't been active in, 2 years? At least," Weatherspoon said, "which means the whole northern margin is wrong." He sat back. "I'm not sure they know what they're actually running up there." Colette Dreyfus smiled at the two of them. "Everything all right?" "Fine," said Weatherspoon. "Just comparing notes." He said it pleasantly. But the word fine had a particular weight to it, the kind of fine that preceded a polite withdrawal, a follow-up email that began with, "After further consideration." Russell had understood every word. His mother had been from Montreal. He had grown up bilingual in the way that children of mixed-language households often do. French at home with her, English at school. The 2 languages sitting side by side in his head without friction or effort. He had never thought of it as remarkable. It was simply how he was made. He had also spent 4 years in his 30s working with a German engineering firm that had a contract with a Northern Ontario mining operation, which was how he had learned enough German to read technical documents and follow a conversation. And he had taught himself Mandarin over the course of 7 years, slowly, imperfectly, in the early mornings before Emma woke up, because Torrance's largest cross-border freight account was with a Shenzhen-based manufacturer, and the relationship had always felt brittle in ways that he suspected had something to do with translation loss. He was not fluent in the way of someone who had lived inside a language their whole life, but he was fluent in the way that mattered. He understood what people meant when they thought no one was listening. The meeting continued. Weatherspoon and his colleague continued to exchange observations in French, with the easy fluency of people who have used a second language as a professional privacy screen for so long it has become habit. They were not cruel about it. They were simply candid, the way people are when they believe the room cannot understand them. "The operational projections are optimistic," his colleague said. "The infrastructure knowledge seems thin," Weatherspoon agreed. "I don't think anyone here has actually been to a northern node recently. The plan was built in an office. Most plans are." Russell looked at his hands. He thought about Emma, who was 13 now, and who was probably doing homework at the kitchen table at this exact moment, probably with her headphones on, probably with the small lamp he had bought her 2 Christmases ago, because she complained the overhead light was too harsh. He thought about how she had asked him last week, very seriously, whether he liked his job. He had said yes. which was true, technically. He liked the work. He liked the systems, the logic of them, the way a routing problem had a shape that could be understood and addressed. He was less certain about the rest of it. He looked back at the table. Paul Weatherspoon had turned to look at him, not with any particular intention, just the idle glance of a man letting his attention drift. Their eyes met for a moment. Weatherspoon looked away. Derek Faulkner was midway through the risk mitigation slide when the presentation software crashed. It happened without warning. The screen went to a white rectangle, and then to black, and then to a blue error message that nobody in the room had the vocabulary to interpret except Russell, who had seen it before and knew that it meant the connection between the laptop and the boardroom system had been severed at the driver level, and that restarting the presentation software would not fix it. Derek pressed several keys with the specific energy of a man who is doing something because it feels better than doing nothing. The screen stayed black. "Do we have IT on call?" Colette Dreyfus asked. "Russell can look at it," someone said. It was the office manager, Lynn, who was seated near the door. She said it the way you'd say the thermostats on the wall. Practical, unremarkable. Russell crossed the room. He crouched beside the presentation terminal, opened the system panel, and diagnosed the problem in about 90 seconds. It was a driver conflict that had been introduced by a software update the previous evening. He had actually flagged this specific risk to the IT team 3 weeks ago, when the update had been scheduled, and had suggested a rollback protocol for the boardroom system specifically. The IT team had thanked him for the note. He fixed it in 4 minutes. The slides returned. "Thank you," Colette Dreyfus said, with the tone of someone thanking a vending machine for dispensing correctly. He returned to the side of the room. Weatherspoon said something to his colleague, still in French, just barely audible. "At least someone here knows how things actually work." It was the word "actually" that stayed with Russell. He had heard it used that way before, as a dividing line between people who understood something in theory and people who understood it in practice. He had spent most of his career on the practice side of that line, which was not a glamorous place to be, but it was the place from which you could see clearly what was real. The meeting moved back into the presentation. Derek was recovering his footing, pivoting to the customer retention data, which was solid and genuinely impressive. Colette was nodding with the focused energy of someone who has decided the meeting is back on track. And then Weatherspoon said, in French, to no one in particular, half under his breath, "I want to understand the northern routing before we commit anything. The numbers in this plan don't reflect what I know about those corridors." His colleague murmured in agreement. Weatherspoon continued, "If we're wrong about transit times by even 8%, the margin disappears. I need to know if anyone here actually understands the infrastructure." And then, a beat later, the thing Russell had been listening for, the thing he had heard before in different rooms in different languages, the question that was never quite asked aloud but was always present. Does this company actually know what it has? Russell Holt was quiet for another 10 seconds. Then he said, in French, from the side of the room, "The Kapuskasing Depot was decommissioned in March of 2023. The routing corridor was redirected through Hearst, which added approximately 90 minutes to the northern transit average. The 2021 model in the appendix doesn't account for that, which means the projected margin on the northern expansion is off by closer to 12%, not 8%. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces. Weatherspoon first, then his colleague, then Derek Faulkner, then Colette Dreyfus, in that order, each of them turning to look at the man standing at the side of the room with the water pitcher and the backup laptop. Russell continued, still in French, because he had started and it seemed strange to stop. The Hearst reroute also has seasonal constraints. Winter maintenance windows reduce throughput by roughly 20% from January through mid-March. That's not in the plan either. Weatherspoon stared at him for a moment. Then he said, in English, "Who are you?" Russell answered in English, Russell Holt, Senior Infrastructure Coordinator. You built these routing systems? Most of them. Weatherspoon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Colette Dreyfus. Then he looked back at Russell. Can you walk me through the actual Northern Corridor? Not the 2021 model. The real one. Yes, Russell said. I can do that. He did it without slides. He used the whiteboard at the side of the room, a whiteboard that had been used up to this point, to write the day's agenda and the Wi-Fi password. He drew the corridor from memory, the primary routes, the Hearst reroute, the seasonal constraints, the 3 proposed northern nodes and their realistic throughput capacities, the cross-border handoff point near Thunder Bay and the processing window reality on the American side. He spoke for 22 minutes. He answered 6 questions from Weatherspoon directly, 2 from Weatherspoon's colleague, and 1 from a junior member of the Meridian team who hadn't spoken until that point. He answered them in the language each question was asked in. Weatherspoon's colleague switched to French once, then twice, then simply continued in French because it was faster. Russell answered without noting the switch. At one point, the junior Meridian associate, a young man who had been introduced as being from their Hong Kong office, asked a clarification question about customs processing times in Mandarin, directed at his own colleague, not at Russell. Russell answered it anyway. That was the moment when the room changed, not dramatically, not with gasps or applause. It changed the way light changes in late afternoon, gradually, and then all at once, and you couldn't point to the exact moment it had shifted. Paul Weatherspoon leaned forward, both forearms on the table, the skepticism in his face replaced by something that looked like genuine attention. Derek Faulkner had closed his laptop. Colette Dreyfus was watching Russell with an expression he couldn't quite name. He thought about Rebecca sometimes when things like this happened. Not with sadness exactly, or not only with sadness. She had been the one to encourage him to take the German contract. All those years ago, she had sat with him at the kitchen table while Emma was asleep and said, "You're better at this than you let people see. That's not a virtue, Russell. That's just waste." He had never entirely believed her. He had spent his whole career being the person who made things work, which was different from being the person who got credit for making things work. He had told himself it didn't matter. He wasn't sure anymore whether that was true or whether it was just the story he had found easiest to carry. The meeting went over by 40 minutes. When it ended, Paul Weatherspoon shook hands around the table and then walked to where Russell was capping the whiteboard markers and said, "I want to be direct with you." "All right," Russell said. "The plan Derek presented has problems. You know that. I do. But the operational knowledge behind it, what you just walked us through, that's solid. That's actually what we'd be investing in if we move forward." He paused. "Who built the routing systems on your American corridor?" "I did the Northern Depot integration?" "Yes. The cross-border tracking protocol. The one that flagged the Thunder Bay backlog issue in 2022 before it became a failure?" Russell looked at him. "You know about that?" "Meridian had freight moving through that corridor in 2022, Weatherspoon said. Torrance was the only logistics partner that caught the bottleneck before it cost anyone money. I made a note of it at the time." He met Russell's eyes. "I didn't know it was you." "It was me," Russell said. Weatherspoon nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'd like to talk to you further. Not in this room. Somewhere we can have a real conversation." He drove home that evening on the 401, in the particular dense traffic of a Toronto Tuesday, and he thought about nothing specific. He let the radio play. He thought about dinner. He thought about whether Emma had remembered to take her lunch from the fridge that morning. She had not. She had texted him at 11:47 a.m. to say she'd bought a sandwich from the cafeteria and that it had been mediocre at best, which was a phrase she had recently adopted from a podcast and was deploying with increasing enthusiasm. He stopped at the grocery store on Dundas and bought pasta. And the specific brand of pasta sauce that Emma had recently declared the only acceptable one. and he drove the last 8 minutes home with the windows down because the October air was cold and clean in a way that felt earned after a day inside. Emma was at the kitchen table when he came in, headphones around her neck, the small lamp on, her geography textbook open to a page about the Canadian Shield. She looked up when he came through the door. "You're late," she said without accusation. "I know. Meeting ran over." She watched him put the groceries on the counter. Good meeting or bad meeting? He considered the question with more care than she was probably expecting. "I don't know yet," he said. "Different. Different how?" He filled the pot with water and set it on the stove. "I talked more than usual." Emma looked at him for a moment with the particular attentiveness she sometimes had. The quality of listening that Rebecca had called her best and most underrated quality, the ability to hear what was actually being said underneath the words that were being used. "Did it help?" Emma asked. Russell thought about Weatherspoon's expression when he had answered the Mandarin question. He thought about the whiteboard, the markers, the 22 minutes of something that had felt, for the first time in a long time, like being seen doing the work he actually did. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Emma nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She turned back to the Canadian Shield. "Good," she said. "You should talk more." 3 weeks later, Colette Dreyfus called Russell into her office. She had reorganized it since taking the job. The desk was in a different position, the bookshelves were fuller. There was a plant near the window that appeared to be thriving. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and he sat down. "I want to be honest with you," she said, which was the second time in 3 weeks that someone had opened a conversation with him that way, and which Russell found mildly interesting. "All right," he said. "The Meridian Partnership is moving forward," she said. Paul Weatherspoon made it conditional on a revised infrastructure plan, one that reflects the actual operational reality. She looked at him. "He asked specifically that you be involved in building that plan." Russell waited. "I've been asking around about you," Colette said, "in the last 3 weeks, talking to people who've worked with you, looking at what you've actually built here." She paused. "I should have done that before now." He didn't tell her it was all right. It wasn't all right exactly, but it wasn't the thing he most needed to address. "The routing report I sent to Derek in February," Russell said. "The one about the Sudbury data. I read it last week," she said. "All 3 pages." She looked at him steadily. "It was right." "I know," he said. "That's going in a new file," she said. "One that has your name on it. The position we're creating to lead the Northern Expansion infrastructure. I'd like you to consider it." She named a salary that was 28% higher than his current one. It would mean more visibility, more representation at this table. Russell looked at the window. The plant near it was a pothos, he thought, the kind that thrived on neglect. Rebecca had grown them all over their first apartment, trailing from the shelves, green and persistent. He had never had the knack for them himself. He always forgot to water them at the right intervals, not out of carelessness but out of the particular forgetfulness of someone who is always thinking about something else. "I'd like to think about it," he said. "Of course," Colette said. "But Russell," she paused, and something in her expression shifted into something more direct, less formal. "For what it's worth. What you did in that boardroom, that wasn't just knowing French. Anyone can take a language class." She looked at him evenly. "That was 11 years of knowing exactly how this company works. That's not something we should have needed an outside investor to show us." He nodded once. "No," he said, "it isn't." He talked to Emma about it that night. Not all of it, not the salary number, not the formal details, but the shape of it. He told her there might be a change at work, and that it was a good kind of change, and that he was still thinking. She was doing the dishes when he told her this, rinsing a bowl with the specific efficiency of someone who has been doing her own chores long enough to have developed a system. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "Probably," he said. "What are you thinking about?" He leaned against the counter. "Whether it'll actually be different," he said. or whether it'll just be the same thing with a bigger title. Emma turned off the tap and looked at him. She was 13, and she was tall for it, and she had Rebecca's eyes and Russell's habit of going very still when she was thinking seriously. "Dad," she said, "you fixed the system they were using wrong for 2 years, in one meeting, while getting people water." She set the bowl in the rack. "It'll be different because you'll be different, because they'll know who you are now." He looked at his daughter for a moment. "Your mother used to say something like that," he said. Emma smiled. Small, private, the kind of smile that holds something careful. "I know," she said. "I've been saving it." 2 months later, the revised Northern Expansion Plan was submitted to Meridian Pacific Partners. It was 63 pages. Russell had built the infrastructure model at the center of it over 4 weeks, mostly in the evenings, at the kitchen table, while Emma did homework across from him, and the small lamp made a warm circle of light between them. Paul Weatherspoon called it the clearest infrastructure assessment he had seen in 12 years of evaluating logistics partnerships. He said this in the opening remarks of the formal partnership signing, in front of the same room of people, at the same table that cost more than most people's first car. He said it in English. And then, because he was a precise man who understood the value of being understood, he repeated it in French. Russell was seated at the table this time, not at the side of the room, not near the water pitcher. At the table with his name on a placard and a folder in front of him and 11 years of knowing exactly how things worked, which was, it turned out, the most valuable thing in the room, and had been, quietly and without announcement, all along.